The stagecoach lurched to a stop with a groan of protest from its weathered wheels, sending up a cloud of dust that hung in the dry Texas air like a dirty veil. Margaret Sullivan pressed a gloved hand to her throat, fighting back the cough that threatened to escape. Through the grimy window, she caught her first glimpse of Willow Creek, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the vast, unforgiving landscape. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice rough as the gravel road they'd traveled. "This here's your stop." Margaret gathered her traveling dress with trembling fingers, the navy wool now coated with a fine layer of dust despite her best efforts to keep it clean during the 3-day journey from St. Louis. Her mother's cameo brooch caught the harsh afternoon sun as she adjusted it at her throat, a small piece of refinement in this crude new world. The driver helped her down, his calloused hand engulfing hers for a brief moment before he turned to unload her trunk. It landed with a thud in the dirt, looking as out of place as she felt. Everything she owned in the world was contained in that battered leather case. Her few dresses, her books, the daguerreotype of her late parents, and the bundle of letters that had brought her to this desolate place. "You sure someone's meeting you, miss?" The driver squinted at her with concern. "Ain't safe for a lady to be standing alone out here." "Mr. Theodore Blackwood will be here shortly," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. "He's expecting me." The driver shrugged, climbed back onto his perch, and with a crack of his whip, the stagecoach rumbled away, leaving her standing in the middle of the dusty main street. She watched it disappear, fighting the urge to run after it, to beg for passage back to civilization. But there was nothing left for her in St. Louis. The factory where she'd worked had closed, her boarding house room had been rented to another, and the meager savings she'd accumulated had been spent on this journey. Theodore Blackwood's advertisement in the matrimonial news had seemed like Providence itself, a respectable rancher seeking a capable wife, offering a good home and security in exchange for companionship and household management. His letters had been proper, businesslike, describing his ranch and his need for a helpmate. She'd been honest about her circumstances, her education, her willingness to work hard. When he'd sent the money for her passage, she'd felt the first real hope she'd experienced since her parents' death 2 years prior. Now, standing in the blazing sun, she wondered if she'd been a fool. The town seemed to watch her with curious eyes. She could see faces peering from windows, men lounging against the saloon's wooden posts, women pausing in their errands to stare. A lady in a pink dress with too much lace whispered behind her fan to her companion. 2 cowboys on the wooden sidewalk nudged each other and grinned. Margaret lifted her chin and straightened her spine. She'd faced worse than curious stares. She checked the small watch pinned to her bodice. Theodore was now 20 minutes late. Perhaps he'd been delayed at the ranch. These things happened. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel perspiration gathering beneath her corset. Her throat was parched, but she didn't dare leave her trunk unattended to seek water. Finally, she saw a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black vest over a white shirt that had seen better days. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his stride was purposeful. This must be Theodore. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out when he was near enough to hear. He stopped several feet away, pushing his hat back to reveal a face that might have been handsome, if not for the scowl twisting his features. His eyes, a cold gray like winter sky, traveled from her dusty boots to her carefully pinned hair with obvious displeasure. "You're Margaret Sullivan?" His voice carried disbelief. "I am." She extended her hand in greeting, but he didn't take it. "You're not what I expected." The words stung, but she kept her expression pleasant. "The journey was quite long. Mr. Blackwood, I'm certain I look a fright, but—" "It ain't how you look," he interrupted, his scowl deepening. "Though you're plainer than your letters suggested. It's what I've been hearing. I beg your pardon. Had a wire from your previous employer in St. Louis, Mr. Hartley from the factory. Says you were dismissed for arguing with the floor supervisor. Says you're stubborn as a mule and got opinions about everything." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks, But it wasn't from embarrassment. It was anger. "Mister," Hartley dismissed me because I suggested the girls needed a 10-minute break in their 12-hour shift. "If that makes me stubborn, that's exactly what I mean." Theodore cut her off, his voice rising. "Not 5 minutes here and you're already arguing. I need a wife who knows her place, who'll run my house and raise my children without questioning every blessed thing I say. Mr. Blackwood, surely we can discuss." "Nothing to discuss." He took a step back as if her stubborn nature might be contagious. "I paid your passage here as a courtesy, but that's where my obligation ends. You're not suitable, too educated, too opinionated, too difficult. A man needs a wife who'll obey, not debate." The small crowd that had gathered pretended to go about their business, but Margaret could feel their eyes upon her, could hear the whispers starting. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Then you should have specified in your advertisement that you sought a servant, not a wife," she said quietly. His face flushed red. "Any decent woman knows what's expected. The fact that you don't just proves my point. You're too stubborn for your own good, Miss Sullivan. No man in his right mind would take you on." With that pronouncement, delivered loud enough for half the town to hear, Theodore Blackwood turned on his heel and strode away, leaving her standing alone with her trunk in the middle of the street. The whispers grew louder. She caught fragments. "Poor thing. Serves her right. Mail-order brides. Never works out. Too proud for her own good." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her trunk, but she kept her head high. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these strangers who seemed to take perverse pleasure in her humiliation. "Where's the nearest boarding house?" she asked a woman passing by. The woman looked her up and down with a mixture of pity and disapproval. "Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable establishment 2 blocks down, but she don't take in single ladies without references or a man to vouch for them." "I see. Perhaps a hotel, then?" "The Cattleman's Rest might have a room," a man called out, and several others laughed. Margaret didn't understand the joke, but from their leering expressions, she gathered it wasn't a respectable establishment. She gripped the handle of her trunk with both hands and began to drag it down the street, ignoring the snickers and stares. There had to be somewhere, a church perhaps, or a kind family who might take pity on her until she could find work. The sun was brutal and the trunk was heavy. Her fine boots, suitable for St. Louis streets, slipped in the dusty ruts. Sweat trickled down her back, and her carefully arranged hair began to come loose from its pins. But still, she walked with her chin up, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "Dignity costs nothing but is worth everything." She'd made it half a block when she heard spurs jingling behind her. She didn't turn, expecting another crude comment or false offer of help, but the footsteps stopped, and a shadow fell across her path. "That's no work for a lady." The voice was deep, measured, with a hint of something, not quite sympathy, but understanding perhaps. She looked up to see a man in worn leather chaps and a gray shirt that had been mended more than once. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of prairie grass. Unlike the others who'd stared at her, his expression held no mockery. "I'm managing," she said, tightening her grip on the trunk. "I can see that." He didn't move to help without permission. She noticed, just stood there, patient as a mountain. But managing and needing to manage are 2 different things. Before she could respond, he'd bent down and lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing at all. "Where were you headed?" I'm not certain. It seems the boarding house won't accept me without a proper reference." He nodded as if this didn't surprise him. "Town's got particular ideas about propriety. Name's Sam McKenna. I own a spread about 5 miles north." "Margaret Sullivan," she replied automatically, then added with a bitter smile, "Though I suppose you heard that already, along with the rest of my shortcomings. Heard Theodore Blackwood making a fool of himself, if that's what you mean." He shifted the trunk to his shoulder. "Man orders a wife from a catalog, then gets surprised when she's got a mind of her own, like ordering a horse sight unseen, then complaining it ain't broke to saddle. Despite everything, Margaret found herself almost smiling. I suppose I should have advertised myself as fully broken to harness. Would have been false advertising. He studied her for a moment, those green eyes seeing more than she'd like. You got anywhere to go, Miss Sullivan? Any kin in Texas? No. The word came out smaller than she intended. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with something. The crowd had dispersed somewhat, but she could still feel the weight of their judgment, could still hear Theodore's words echoing, "No man in his right mind would take you on." Finally, Sam McKenna spoke, his voice carrying clear across the street. "If anyone asks, you're spoken for. You're my intended. Come to visit the ranch before we marry. That should quiet the gossips and get you a room at Mrs. Patterson's." Margaret stared at him in shock. "Mr. McKenna, I couldn't possibly—" "It's a practical solution to a practical problem," he interrupted. "I need help at the ranch. My housekeeper up and married last month, and the hands can't cook worth a damn. You need work and a place to stay. We'll call it a trial arrangement. Month's wages in advance. Room and board included. If it don't suit either of us after that, I'll pay your passage to wherever you want to go." "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." He was quiet long enough that she wondered if he'd answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Maybe because I've been where you are, standing in the street with nothing but pride to keep me upright. Maybe because Theodore Blackwood's an ass who wouldn't know a good woman if she bit him. Or maybe—" He paused, a slight smile softening his weathered features. "Maybe because any woman who can face down that kind of humiliation without shedding a tear is exactly the kind of help I need at my ranch." Margaret looked at this stranger who offered salvation without conditions, who spoke of her pride as a strength rather than a flaw. She thought of her alternatives: the dusty street, the leering men, the closed doors of respectable establishments. "It's not charity," he added, as if sensing her hesitation. "I'll work you hard. Ranch life ain't easy, and I won't coddle you because you're from the city, but you'll be treated fair and paid honest wages. And if people talk, people always talk. Question is whether you'll let their words define you or make your own way." Margaret Sullivan, who'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger only to be rejected for the very qualities that had helped her survive, made her decision. She looked Sam McKenna in the eye and nodded. "Then if anyone asks," she said clearly, loud enough for the lingering onlookers to hear, "I'm Margaret Sullivan. Mr. McKenna's intended. Come to see his ranch before we make things official." Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, or relief. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Let's get you to Mrs. Patterson's, then. Tomorrow's soon enough to see the ranch." As they walked down the dusty street together, her trunk balanced easily on his shoulder. Margaret allowed herself one glance back at the spot where she'd stood abandoned just minutes before. The dirt showed no trace of her presence, as if the earth itself had already forgotten her humiliation. But she would remember. She would remember Theodore Blackwood's words, the crowd's whispers, the closed doors and hard faces, and she would remember the moment a stranger looked at her stubborn pride and saw strength instead of shame. The sun was still brutal, the dust still thick, and tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for now, she walked beside Sam McKenna with her head high and her dignity intact, a mail-order bride rejected but not defeated, carrying herself like what she had always been, a woman too stubborn to break. The whispers followed them down Main Street like tumbleweeds in a dust devil. Margaret kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of every stare, hear every murmured comment that drifted from doorways and wooden sidewalks. "That's her, the mail-order bride Blackwood rejected. Too proud for her own good. I heard. Sam McKenna's taking her on? Man must be desperate." Sam walked beside her unhurriedly, seemingly oblivious to the gossip swirling around them. His presence was solid, unshakable. like a wall between her and the worst of the town's judgment. Still, each whispered word felt like a small stone thrown at her dignity. They passed the millinery shop where two women in fashionable bonnets stopped their conversation to gawk. One of them, a blonde woman with perfectly arranged curls, looked Margaret up and down with such obvious disdain that Margaret felt her cheeks burn anew. "Disgraceful," the woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Coming all this way to trap a man into marriage, then having the audacity to argue with him. No wonder he sent her packing." Her companion, a brunette with a pinched expression, nodded eagerly. "My husband says Theodore Blackwood is well rid of her. What kind of wife questions a man's authority? It's unnatural." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her mother's cameo brooch pressing into her palm where she gripped it, the urge to turn around, to defend herself, to explain that wanting basic human dignity didn't make her unnatural, was almost overwhelming. "Steady," Sam murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Don't give them the satisfaction." She forced her hands to relax, forced her breathing to remain even. He was right, of course. Any response would only fuel their gossip, confirm their opinion that she was too emotional, too difficult, too everything that a proper woman shouldn't be. They turned the corner onto 2nd Street, where Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood like a fortress of respectability. It was a 2-story building painted white, with green shutters and a wraparound porch where several elderly women sat fanning themselves and observing the street with hawk-like attention. "That's Mrs. Patterson in the black dress," Sam said quietly. "Fair warning, she's got opinions about everything and everyone." Indeed. The woman in question was already rising from her rocking chair, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their approach. She was a formidable figure despite her small stature, dressed in mourning black that made her silver hair shine like polished metal. Her face bore the kind of lines that came from decades of disapproval. "Mr. McKenna," she called out before they'd even reached the porch steps. "What's this I hear about you claiming that person as your intended?" Margaret felt the word person land like a slap. Not woman, not lady, person, as if her very humanity was in question. Sam touched the brim of his hat politely. "Afternoon, Mrs. Patterson. I'd like to arrange a room for Miss Sullivan here. She's come to visit before we formalize our engagement." The other women on the porch tittered behind their fans. "Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed to slits. "I run a respectable establishment. Mr. McKenna, I don't take in women of questionable character." "Nothing questionable about Miss Sullivan's character," Sam replied evenly. "That's not what Theodore Blackwood says. He was just here not 20 minutes ago, warning me about her. Said she's stubborn as a mule, argumentative, and wholly unsuitable for marriage. Said she got herself dismissed from her employment for causing trouble." Margaret stepped forward before Sam could respond, her chin lifting despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Mrs. Patterson, I suggested that women working 12-hour shifts in a factory might benefit from a brief rest period. If that makes me troublesome—" "There, Mrs." Patterson pointed a gnarled finger at her triumphantly. "You see? Already arguing, already making excuses. This is exactly what Mr. Blackwood warned me about." The other women murmured their agreement. One of them, a younger woman with mousy brown hair, spoke up timidly. A proper woman knows when to hold her tongue. "My dear Henry always says—" "Your dear Henry says a lot of things after his 3rd whiskey," Sam interrupted dryly, causing the woman to flush red and fall silent. He turned back to Mrs. Patterson. "The lady needs a room. I'll vouch for her character and pay a week in advance. Your money's good, Mr. McKenna, but my reputation is worth more. I won't have her stirring up trouble among my other boarders with her modern ideas and willful ways." Margaret felt something inside her snap. The exhaustion of the journey, the humiliation of Theodore's rejection, the weight of all these strangers' judgment. It was too much. She straightened her spine and looked Mrs. Patterson directly in the eye. "You're quite right, Mrs. Patterson. I am willful. I do have opinions. I believe women deserve fair treatment and basic human dignity. I believe in speaking up when I see injustice. And if that makes me unsuitable for your establishment, then I wouldn't want to stay here anyway." The porch fell silent except for the creaking of rocking chairs and the distant sound of horses. "Mrs." Patterson's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "Well, I never—" "No," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I don't imagine you ever have. You've never had to work in a factory until your fingers bled. You've never had to choose between speaking up for what's right and keeping a roof over your head. You've never had to travel 1,000 miles on the promise of a new life, only to be discarded like damaged goods because you dared to have thoughts of your own." She could hear gasps from the other women, could see faces appearing in windows along the street. She was making a spectacle of herself, confirming every harsh word Theodore had said about her, but she couldn't stop. "You sit here in your comfortable house, in your respectable morning dress, passing judgment on women who've had to fight for every scrap of dignity they possess. And you call me troublesome? At least my trouble comes from wanting to help others, not from taking pleasure in their misfortune." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could feel her heart pounding, could taste copper in her mouth where she'd bitten her tongue. She'd done it now, burned whatever bridge Sam McKenna had been trying to build for her. But when she glanced at him, expecting disappointment or anger, she found something else entirely. His green eyes held a gleam that might have been admiration, and the corner of his mouth twitched as if he was fighting back a smile. "Mrs." Patterson finally found her voice. "Get off my property this instant, and you, Sam McKenna, should be ashamed of yourself, associating with such a virago." "Proud to associate with her," Sam said calmly, picking up Margaret's trunk again. "Come on, Miss Sullivan. We'll find other arrangements." They walked away from the boarding house with as much dignity as possible, though Margaret could hear the explosion of shocked conversation behind them. Her legs felt shaky, and she wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or the aftermath of her outburst. "I'm sorry," she said once they were out of earshot. "You were trying to help, and I ruined it." Sam actually chuckled. "Ruined it? Hell, that was the most entertainment this town's had in months. Did you see Mrs. Patterson's face? Like she'd swallowed a live fish." "It's not funny. I've just confirmed everything Theodore said about me. The whole town will be talking about this." They were already talking. Only difference is now they've got something interesting to say. They walked in silence for a moment before Margaret asked, "Where will I stay now? You said Mrs. Patterson's was the only respectable." "You'll stay at the ranch," Sam said decisively. "Got a separate cabin where my housekeeper used to live. It's proper enough. You'll have your privacy. And my foreman's wife is there during the day. We'll let the gossips make what they will of it." Margaret stopped walking. "Mr. McKenna, I can't. Your reputation—" "My reputation can handle it. Been through worse than small-town gossip." He paused, studying her face. "Unless you're having second thoughts about the arrangement." She thought about her alternatives. The dusty street, the leering men at the Cattleman's Rest, the closed doors of every respectable establishment. Then she thought about the way Sam had stood up for her, the way he'd called her display of temper entertainment instead of disgraceful. "No second thoughts," she said firmly, "though you may have them once you realize just how stubborn I can be." "I'm counting on it," he said, surprising her. "Ranch work takes stubbornness. Cattle don't respect anything else." They retrieved his wagon from the livery stable, where the stable boy gaped at Margaret with undisguised curiosity. News had traveled fast. Sam loaded her trunk in the back while she climbed up to the bench seat, grateful for the shade of the wagon's canopy. As they drove through town, Margaret caught glimpses of the aftermath of her confrontation with Mrs. Patterson. People clustered in small groups, talking animatedly. Some pointed at their wagon. A few men touched their hats respectfully to Sam, but ignored her entirely. Near the general store, Theodore Blackwood himself stood with a group of men, no doubt sharing his version of events. When he saw them, his face darkened with anger. "McKenna," he called out. "You're making a fool of yourself, taking on my leavings." Sam pulled the horses to a stop. "Only fool I see is a man who can't tell the difference between spirit and stubbornness. She's trouble. I tell you, mark my words. Within a week you'll be begging me to take her off your hands. The only thing I'd beg from you, Blackwood, is the good sense to keep your mouth shut about a lady you clearly didn't deserve." Theodore's face flushed red. "Lady? She's no lady. She's a sharp-tongued harpy who doesn't know her place." Margaret felt Sam tense beside her, saw his hands tighten on the reins. Before he could respond, before another scene could unfold in the street, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let's go," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." Sam looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He clicked to the horses, and they moved on, leaving Theodore sputtering in the street behind them. As they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, Margaret finally allowed herself to relax slightly. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant westward, painting the grassland gold and amber. The air was cleaner here, free from the dust and judgment of the town. "Thank you," she said after a while, "for defending me back there." "Wasn't defending you," Sam replied, "just stating facts. Besides, seemed like you were doing a fine job defending yourself. That speech you gave Mrs. Patterson reminded me of a preacher delivering hellfire and brimstone, only with better vocabulary." Despite everything, Margaret found herself almost laughing. "My mother would be mortified. She always said a lady should never raise her voice in public." "What else did your mother say?" The question was asked gently, and Margaret found herself answering, "That dignity costs nothing but is worth everything. That education is never wasted, even on a woman. That kindness and strength aren't opposites, but companions." Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Margaret touched the cameo at her throat. "She died 2 years ago, along with my father. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. I'm sorry for your loss." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically, the horses' hooves beating a steady tempo. The landscape rolled out before them, vast and intimidating, but somehow honest in its harshness. Not like the town with its false respectability and hidden cruelties. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret ventured. "Why did you really offer to help me? The truth this time." Sam was quiet long enough that she wondered if he'd answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her and our son both. After that, I threw myself into the ranch work. Figured if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't have to think. Worked myself near to death. Truth be told, it was my foreman's wife, Maria, who finally told me I needed help, or I'd be joining them sooner rather than later." He paused, guiding the horses around a rough patch in the road. "I've been trying to hire help for months, but nobody wants to work that far from town, especially not for a widower with a reputation for being difficult. When I saw you standing there in the street, facing down the whole town with your chin up, I thought maybe we might understand each other. Two difficult people making the best of things." Margaret absorbed this, feeling a kinship she hadn't expected. "So we're both too stubborn for our own good?" "Seems that way." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, though I prefer to call it determined. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the prairie. In the distance, Margaret could see a cluster of buildings that must be the ranch, her new home, at least temporarily. The knot of anxiety in her stomach tightened. "What if they're right?" she asked suddenly. "What if I am too difficult? What if I cause you nothing but trouble?" Sam glanced at her, his green eyes serious. "Then you'll be too difficult and cause trouble. World won't end. Ranch will still need running. Cattle will still need tending. Life goes on. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's people who make things complicated." He gestured toward the ranch buildings growing closer. "Out here, what matters is whether you can work, whether you keep your word, whether you treat folks fair. Everything else is just noise." As they approached the ranch, Margaret could see it was larger than she'd expected. There was a main house built of timber and stone, several barns and outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and in the distance, the dark shapes of cattle dotting the range. It spoke of hard work and careful management, of someone who'd built something lasting despite personal tragedy. "It's impressive," she said honestly. "It's home." Sam replied simply, "Or it will be, for as long as you choose to stay." The word choose struck her. When was the last time she'd had a real choice? She'd been driven by necessity for so long, taking whatever work she could find, accepting Theodore's offer because she had no alternatives, standing in that dusty street with nowhere to go. But Sam McKenna was offering her a choice. Hard work. Yes, challenges. Certainly, but also respect, fair treatment, and the freedom to be exactly who she was. Stubborn, opinionated, and all. As they pulled into the ranch yard, several men emerged from the barn to stare curiously. A Mexican woman with graying hair came out of the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was kind but wary as she took in Margaret's dusty traveling dress and tired face. "Maria," Sam called out. "This is Miss Sullivan. She'll be staying in the old cabin, helping with the house and accounts." Maria's expression softened slightly. "Señorita," she said with a small curtsy, "you must be tired from your journey." "Thank you, yes," Margaret replied, grateful for the first kind words she'd heard from a woman all day. As Sam helped her down from the wagon, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the water trough. Her hair was disheveled, her dress wrinkled and dusty, her face drawn with exhaustion. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd traveled too far and lost too much. But she also saw something else in that wavering reflection, the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine, the defiant tilt of her chin. Theodore Blackwood had called her too stubborn. Mrs. Patterson had called her troublesome. The town had labeled her unsuitable. Standing in the yard of Sam McKenna's ranch, surrounded by strangers who would no doubt form their own opinions soon enough, Margaret Sullivan decided she could live with those labels. She'd been called worse things than stubborn. At least here, it seemed stubbornness might be counted as a virtue rather than a flaw. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her supposedly difficult nature. But tonight, she had a roof over her head offered freely. Work to do that would be fairly paid, and the novel experience of being accepted, stubbornness and all. It wasn't the new life she'd imagined when she'd answered Theodore Blackwood's advertisement, but as Sam carried her trunk toward the small cabin that would be her home, and Maria asked if she preferred coffee or tea with her supper, Margaret thought it might be something better. It might be a life she could choose, rather than one chosen for her, and for a woman too stubborn to accept anything less than dignity. That made all the difference. Sam McKenna had been standing by the corral fence for the better part of an hour, ostensibly checking the horses, but actually watching the scene unfolding near the well. Margaret Sullivan, 3 days into her stay at the ranch, was currently engaged in what could only be described as a battle of wills with his most stubborn ranch hand. "Miss, I'm telling you, that ain't how it's done," Jake Porter was saying, his weathered face creased with frustration. "We've been drawing water this way for years, and wasting half of it in the process," Margaret replied crisply, not backing down an inch. "If you'd simply adjust the angle of the trough, the water would flow directly instead of splashing everywhere." "Women don't know nothing about ranch work," Jake muttered, loud enough to be heard. Sam saw Margaret's spine stiffen, recognized the warning sign from their encounter with Mrs. Patterson, but instead of launching into a speech, she simply smiled sweetly and proceeded to demonstrate her point by repositioning the wooden trough herself, her city-bred hands struggling with the weight, but managing nonetheless. The water flowed smoothly, without a drop wasted. Jake stared, then spat tobacco juice to the side. "Lucky guess," he grumbled before stomping off. Sam shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. In 3 days, Margaret had managed to reorganize his kitchen stores, implement a new system for tracking supplies, and apparently now was redesigning his water collection, all while various ranch hands, set in their ways and suspicious of change, fought her at every turn. He'd known she would face resistance. Ranch life was hard enough without adding the burden of being a woman trying to establish authority among men who'd never taken orders from anyone in skirts. But he'd underestimated both the level of opposition and Margaret's sheer determination to prove herself. "Stubborn woman," he murmured, but there was admiration in it. "She's something, ain't she?" Sam turned to find his foreman, William Hartley, approaching. Will was one of the few who'd accepted Margaret's presence without complaint, possibly because his own wife Maria had vouched for her. "She's holding her own," Sam acknowledged. Will leaned against the fence beside him. "Jake's just sore because she was right about the trough. Been telling him for months we were wasting water, but he wouldn't listen to me neither." They watched as Margaret moved on to her next task, carrying a basket of laundry with the same determination she brought to everything. Her green dress, she'd traded her traveling clothes for more practical wear, was already showing signs of hard work. Dust at the hem and sweat stains beneath the arms. Her hair, once carefully pinned, was escaping in wisps around her face. "The men are placing bets," Will said conversationally. "On what?" "How long before she gives up and heads back east?" "Jake says a week. Tom figures 2. Course, Maria threatened to box the ears of anyone who bet against her, so that's dampened the pool somewhat." Sam's jaw tightened. "She's not going anywhere." Will gave him a knowing look. "You sure about that?" "Way I hear it, she's still getting offers. That fellow from the Double Bar Ranch was in town yesterday, asking about the available Eastern lady." The idea of Margaret being courted by other men shouldn't have bothered Sam. Their arrangement was business. Nothing more. She was free to leave whenever she chose, free to accept a better offer if one came along. But the thought of her in another man's kitchen, bringing her fierce intelligence to bear on another ranch's problems, sat uneasily in his gut. "She's not available," he said more sharply than intended. Will's eyebrows rose. "That's so? Funny. I could have sworn this was a temporary arrangement. Trial basis, you said." Before Sam could respond, a commotion erupted near the chicken coop. Margaret's voice, raised in indignation, carried across the yard. "That is absolutely barbaric." Sam and Will hurried over to find Margaret facing down Tom Briggs, the youngest of the ranch hands. Tom was holding a squawking chicken by its feet, clearly prepared to wring its neck for supper. "It's just a chicken, miss," Tom was saying, bewildered. "We eat them all the time." "Not that one," Margaret said firmly. "That's Henrietta. She's the best layer in the flock." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've been keeping records." She produced a small notebook from her apron pocket. "In 3 days, that hen has produced 5 eggs. While the others average only 3, it would be economically foolish to eat our most productive bird." Tom looked helplessly at Sam, clearly out of his depth. "Boss?" Sam stepped forward, catching Margaret's eye. "She has a point. Tom, choose another bird." Tom released Henrietta, who fluffed her feathers indignantly and strutted away. Margaret looked triumphant until Tom reached for another chicken. "Not that one either," she said quickly. "That's Prudence. She's broody. Might give us chicks soon." "Miss Sullivan," Sam said carefully, "we do need to eat." "Of course we do." She consulted her notebook again. "Take the brown one by the fence. She hasn't laid in 4 days and shows signs of being past her prime." Tom looked between Margaret and Sam, waiting for direction. Sam nodded, trying not to smile at the absurdity of the situation. His mail-order bride reject was now managing his chickens with the same efficiency she'd applied to his water troughs. As Tom departed with the approved chicken, Margaret turned to Sam. "I suppose you think I'm being ridiculous. I think you're being thorough," he replied honestly. "Though I'm curious when you found time to study the chickens that closely." "Early mornings," she said, tucking the notebook away. "I've always been an early riser, and it seems I wake before everyone else. It gave me time to observe and take notes." "Of course she did," Sam wondered what else she'd been observing and cataloging in that neat handwriting of hers. "Walk with me," he said impulsively. "I want to show you something." She fell into step beside him as they headed toward the eastern pasture. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage and grass. "The men are struggling with the changes," he said after a moment. "I've noticed." Her voice was dry. "Jake in particular seems to take personal offense at my existence. He's set in his ways. They all are. This ranch has run the same way for years. And you," she glanced at him sideways, "are you set in your ways too?" He considered the question. "I thought I was. Then my wife died, and I learned that ways can be changed whether you want them to or not. After that, seemed foolish to hold too tight to any particular method of doing things." They'd reached the rise that overlooked the eastern valley. The land rolled out before them, golden in the afternoon light, dotted with cattle and crossed by a winding creek. It was his favorite view on the ranch, the one that reminded him why he'd worked so hard to build something here. Margaret stood quietly beside him, taking it in. Unlike many women he'd known, she didn't feel the need to fill silence with chatter. It was restful, standing there with her, watching the shadows lengthen across the land. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "Wild, but beautiful. This is what you'd be working for," he said. "Not for me, not for the men's approval, but for this. The land doesn't care if you're male or female, eastern or western, stubborn or sweet. It only cares if you show up and do the work." She turned to face him fully. "And do you think I can? Do the work, I mean. Or are you placing bets with the others on when I'll give up?" The directness of the question, and the hint of vulnerability beneath it, caught him off guard. In the golden light, he could see the fatigue around her eyes, the slight droop of her shoulders that she was trying to hide. 3 days of hard work and harder attitudes had taken their toll. "I think," he said slowly, "that you've already done more work in 3 days than my last housekeeper did in a month. I think you've got more steel in your spine than half the men in my employ. And I think anyone betting against you is a fool." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow we're branding cattle. It's hot, dirty work, and the men will be testier than usual. Jake's already complaining about having a woman around during men's work. Then Jake will have to adjust his expectations," she said with a return of her usual spirit. "I assume you'll need meals prepared for the extra hands, and medical supplies ready for injuries. You don't have to be there for the actual branding, Mr. McKenna." She fixed him with a look that he was beginning to recognize. "If I'm to help run this ranch, I need to understand all aspects of its operation. Besides, how else will I catalog which cattle are the most productive?" He laughed, surprising himself with the fullness of it. "You're going to catalog my cattle? Someone should. How else will you know which bloodlines produce the best beef, which cows are the best mothers? Honestly, the lack of record-keeping around here is appalling." "My apologies. Miss Sullivan, I'll be sure to provide you with adequate notebooks for your cataloging endeavors." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face from merely pleasant to something approaching pretty. "Now you're mocking me." "Never," he said, though he was still grinning. "I'm looking forward to seeing Jake's face when you start naming the cattle." "I would never," she protested, then added thoughtfully, "though that spotted heifer near the creek does look like a Bessie." They walked back toward the ranch buildings as the sun touched the horizon. The evening routine was beginning, horses being brought in, lamps being lit, the smell of cooking drifting from the main house where Maria was preparing supper. As they neared the house, they saw a rider approaching on the main road. Sam recognized the horse before he could make out the rider, a showy palomino that belonged to Chester Morrison from the Double Bar Ranch. "Expecting company?" Margaret asked. "No." Sam's mood darkened as Chester came into view, dressed in his Sunday best despite it being a Thursday. "But I can guess why he's here." Chester Morrison was everything Sam wasn't. Smooth-talking, well-dressed, inherited wealth rather than earned. He ran his ranch like a hobby, letting his foreman do the real work while he played at being a gentleman rancher. He was also, if the gossip was true, in the market for a wife. "McKenna," Chester called out as he dismounted with unnecessary flourish. His eyes went immediately to Margaret, and his smile widened. "And this must be the famous Miss Sullivan. Ma'am, your beauty exceeds even the generous descriptions I've heard." Margaret's expression cooled noticeably. "Mr. Morrison, Chester Morrison of the Double Bar Ranch." He swept off his hat and actually bowed, as if they were in a Boston parlor instead of a dusty ranch yard. "I've ridden over specifically to make your acquaintance." "How purposeful of you," Margaret said, her tone neutral. Chester missed the subtle mockery entirely. "I heard about your unfortunate situation with that fool Blackwood. The man clearly has no appreciation for a woman of quality. I, however, am a man of more refined sensibilities." Sam stepped slightly closer to Margaret, a movement that Chester noticed with narrowed eyes. "Miss Sullivan has employment here," Sam said evenly. "Employment?" Chester's eyebrows rose. "Surely a lady of Miss Sullivan's caliber deserves better than servants' wages. I've come to offer an alternative arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Margaret asked, though Sam could tell from her tone that she already knew. "Marriage, of course." Chester said it as if offering her a great favor. "I'm in need of a wife to grace my home, someone with Eastern refinements who can bring culture to this wilderness. You'd have servants of your own, the finest dresses, a position of respect in the community. And in exchange," Margaret's voice was dangerously calm. "Why? In exchange, you'd be my wife, bear my children, manage my household, host my social gatherings, all the things a proper wife does, but in much more comfortable circumstances than—" He gestured vaguely at the ranch around them. "This—" Sam saw Margaret's hands clench in her skirts, saw the familiar straightening of her spine that meant someone was about to receive a piece of her mind. But before she could speak, Jake Porter emerged from the barn. "Boss, that broken fence in the north pasture." He stopped, taking in the scene. "We got trouble?" "No trouble," Sam said, but Jake's arrival had given Chester an audience, and the man had always played to crowds. "I'm simply offering Miss Sullivan a respectable position, since McKenna here seems content to treat her like hired help." Chester's voice carried across the yard, drawing other ranch hands from their evening chores. "A woman of her qualities deserves better than servants' quarters and manual labor." "I'm not a servant," Margaret said quietly, but her words were lost as Tom Briggs and two other hands joined the growing circle. "Course you are," Chester continued, warming to his theme. "What else would you call it? Living in the old housekeeper's cabin, taking orders, doing menial work. It's beneath you, my dear. Let me rescue you from this arrangement." Sam felt his temper rising, but before he could speak, Margaret stepped forward. "Rescue me?" Her voice was low but carried clearly, like a princess in a tower. "Exactly," Chester beamed, missing the danger in her tone. "I knew you'd understand. A woman of your sensibilities—" "Mr. Morrison," Margaret interrupted. "Let me ensure I understand your generous offer. You want to marry me because I have Eastern refinements and can bring culture to your home. In exchange, I would bear your children and host your parties. Is that correct?" "Well, yes, essentially. And what of my thoughts, my opinions, my own desires and goals?" Chester looked genuinely puzzled. "What does that have to do with marriage?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the watching ranch hands. Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "Everything, Mr. Morrison. You see, I've already been rejected by one man for having too many opinions. I've been called stubborn, difficult, unsuitable for marriage. And you know what? They were right." She moved closer to Chester, who actually took a step back. "I am stubborn. I do have opinions about everything. I believe in fair wages and water conservation and naming chickens and keeping detailed records. I believe women deserve rest breaks in factories and choices in marriage. I am absolutely, completely unsuitable to be the kind of wife you're looking for. Now see here, Chester began, his face flushing. But more importantly, Margaret continued, her voice rising. I'm not a prize to be won or a problem to be solved. I'm not waiting for rescue. And I'm certainly not interested in trading one form of servitude for another, no matter how gilded the cage. The yard had gone silent except for the distant lowing of cattle. Chester's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Margaret turned to address the watching ranch hands. And for anyone else who's wondering, yes, I work for wages here. Yes, I live in the housekeeper's cabin. Yes, I take direction from Mr. McKenna. But I chose this position. I negotiated my terms, and I can leave whenever I wish. That's not servitude. That's employment. And it's a sight more freedom than I'd have as Mrs. Chester Morrison. Jake Porter, of all people, let out a low whistle of appreciation. Tom Briggs was grinning openly. Even Will Hartley looked impressed. Chester's face had gone from red to purple. You're making a mistake, Miss Sullivan. You'll regret this when you're old and alone, when no decent man will have you because of your reputation. Then I'll be old and alone with my reputation. Margaret shot back. Better than young and married to a man who sees me as decoration. Chester turned to Sam, apparently expecting male solidarity. You're letting her talk to me this way? Letting her? Sam couldn't help but smile. Mr. Morrison, I don't let Miss Sullivan do anything. She's her own woman, makes her own choices, speaks her own mind. If you've got a problem with what she's saying, I suggest you take it up with her. This is ridiculous. Chester spluttered. He jammed his hat back on his head and stalked toward his horse. You're all fools. She'll destroy the natural order of things. Mark my words. As he mounted his showy palomino, he gave one last pronouncement. No man in his right mind would claim a woman like that. The words hung in the air, an echo of Theodore Blackwood's rejection. Sam saw Margaret's slight flinch, saw the hurt that flashed across her face before she schooled her expression back to defiance. Sam stepped forward, his voice carrying clear and strong across the yard. Then I guess I'm not in my right mind, Morrison, because I'd claim her in a heartbeat. The words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. Margaret turned to stare at him, her eyes wide. Chester's face went slack with shock. You heard me, Sam continued, moving to stand beside Margaret. Any man who can't see the value in a woman with brains, courage, and conviction is the fool. Now get off my land before I help you along. Chester Morrison fled in a cloud of dust, his dignity as battered as his suit would be after the wild ride. The ranch hands dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves. Jake Porter paused before heading to the bunkhouse. That was something, miss, he said gruffly. Never seen anyone put Chester Morrison in his place like that. Maybe you ain't so bad after all. Coming from Jake, it was practically a declaration of friendship. Margaret nodded, seemingly speechless for once. As the yard emptied, Sam and Margaret were left standing together in the gathering dusk. The first stars were appearing, and somewhere a coyote howled in the distance. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Defend me to him. Wasn't defending you. Like I told Morrison, you can defend yourself just fine. He paused, then added, I was defending my own good sense. Man would have to be stupid not to see what you're worth. She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for what you said. About choosing to be here, some of the men needed to hear that. Did you? The question caught him off guard. Did I what? Need to hear it, that I chose to be here. He considered lying, making light of it, but she deserved honesty. Yeah, I did. She smiled then, that transformative smile that made him forget she was supposedly plain. Good, because I meant it. Despite Jake's attitude and Chester Morrison's insulting proposals and chickens that need naming, I choose to be here. Even though no man in his right mind would claim you? He meant it as a joke, but it came out more serious than intended. Especially then, she said, her chin lifting in that familiar gesture of defiance. "I've never been fond of men in their right minds anyway. They tend to be terribly boring." He laughed, and after a moment she joined him. They stood there in the gathering darkness, two difficult people who'd found an understanding, while the ranch settled into its evening rhythms around them. Tomorrow would bring the chaos of branding, Jake's continued resistance, and undoubtedly new challenges to Margaret's authority. Chester Morrison would spread his version of events in town, adding to her reputation as a troublesome woman. There would be more proposals, more criticism, more instances where she'd have to prove herself all over again. But tonight, she'd stood in his ranch yard and chosen to stay, not because she had no options, but because she wanted to be there. She'd named his chickens and improved his water troughs, and put Chester Morrison in his place with a combination of intelligence and fire that took his breath away. Sam McKenna, who'd thought his heart had died with his wife and son, felt something stirring in his chest. It was inconvenient and probably unwise and definitely too soon to name. But like Margaret with her chickens, he'd observed it, cataloged it, and would deal with the implications when the time came. For now, it was enough that she'd chosen to stay. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Margaret stepped out of her cabin, notebook in hand, ready for another day at the McKenna Ranch. 2 weeks had passed since Chester Morrison's dramatic visit, and she'd settled into a routine that, while challenging, felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since her parents' death. She paused at the sight of Maria already hanging laundry, the older woman's movements efficient despite the early hour. "Buenos dias, Maria," Margaret called out, having picked up a few Spanish phrases. "Mornin', mija," Maria replied with a warm smile. "You're up early again. Don't you ever rest?" "Rest is for people who don't have stubborn ranch hands to feed," Margaret said lightly, though they both knew she rose early by choice, not necessity. Maria's expression grew serious. "You should know. There's talk in town. That Morrison man has been spreading stories." Margaret sighed. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that make decent women clutch their pearls and men shake their heads. Says you're a corrupting influence, that you've bewitched Sam into letting you run wild on his ranch." "Bewitched?" Margaret couldn't help but laugh. "If I had those powers, I'd have used them to make Jake stop spitting tobacco juice near my clean laundry." Maria didn't smile. "It's not funny. Mija, there's talk of decent folks avoiding the ranch, of suppliers not wanting to do business with a place that harbors, what did they call you, a modern Jezebel?" The word stung more than Margaret cared to admit. She'd known there would be consequences to rejecting Chester Morrison so publicly, but she hadn't expected such vicious retaliation. "Sam know about this?" she asked. "He knows. Came back from town yesterday looking like thunder. Wouldn't say what happened, but Tom heard from his cousin that Sam had words with Morrison at the feed store." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A group of riders was coming down the main road, moving fast, too fast for a social call. "Get inside," Maria said sharply. "Something's not right." But Margaret stood her ground, watching as the riders thundered into the yard. She recognized several faces from town, including Theodore Blackwood and Chester Morrison. With them was a woman in an expensive purple dress who could only be Agnes Whitmore, the town's self-appointed moral guardian. Sam emerged from the barn, Will and several ranch hands flanking him. His expression was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "Gentlemen," Sam said evenly. "Mrs. Whitmore, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Agnes Whitmore didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've come about the situation. Mr. McKenna. The scandalous situation you've allowed to develop under your roof." "I wasn't aware I had a situation," Sam replied. "Don't play dumb." Theodore Blackwood interjected. "You've got an unmarried woman living on your property, working alongside men, behaving in ways that would make a saloon girl blush." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain still. Any response would only fuel their accusations. "Miss Sullivan is my employee," Sam said. She lives in separate quarters and conducts herself with complete propriety. Propriety? Chester Morrison laughed bitterly. She publicly humiliated me, refused an honorable offer of marriage, and proclaimed her intention to remain unmarried. What kind of woman does that? A woman with sense, Will Hartley muttered, earning a glare from Agnes. Mr. McKenna, Agnes said, her voice dripping with false concern. We've come as representatives of the decent people of Willow Creek. Your arrangement is causing scandal. Suppliers are reluctant to do business with you. Families are keeping their daughters away from town events where she might be present. You're becoming a pariah, and all because of one stubborn woman. She turned her sharp gaze on Margaret. You've bewitched him somehow, haven't you? Made him forget proper Christian behavior. That's enough, Sam said, his voice low and dangerous. But Agnes wasn't finished. We've come with a proposal. Send her away today, and we'll forget this ever happened. Your business relationships will be restored. Your reputation salvaged. Keep her, and you'll find every door in the county closed to you. The yard fell silent except for the restless stamping of horses. Margaret could feel every eye on her, waiting for her reaction. Part of her wanted to pack her things immediately, to spare Sam the trouble she'd brought to his door. But a larger part, the part that had survived factory work and her parents' deaths and Theodore's rejection, refused to bow to their ultimatum. You're talking about Miss Sullivan like she's not standing right here, Sam said finally. Seems to me, if you've got accusations to make, you should make them to her face. Agnes turned to Margaret with theatrical reluctance. Very well, Miss Sullivan. You must see the damage you're causing. No decent woman would stay under these circumstances. If you have any conscience at all, you'll leave immediately. Margaret stepped forward, her notebook still clutched in her hands. Mrs. Whitmore, gentlemen, I understand your concerns. You believe I'm a threat to the moral fabric of your community. Finally, some sense, Theodore said smugly. However, Margaret continued, I'd like to understand exactly what immoral behavior I'm accused of. Working for fair wages, improving ranch efficiency, refusing proposals from men who see wives as property rather than partners. You see, Chester exploded, there she goes again with her radical ideas. Is it radical to believe marriage should be based on mutual respect? Margaret asked calmly. Is it scandalous to choose employment over an unwanted marriage? If so, then yes, I suppose I am a scandal. Agnes drew herself up to her full height. You're corrupting the natural order. Women have their place, and you're refusing to accept it. My place, Margaret said slowly, is wherever I choose to make it. And I choose to make it here, helping run this ranch and earning my keep through honest work. Then you choose to destroy Sam McKenna along with yourself, Agnes said triumphantly. Already the Farmers' Bank is reconsidering his loan for the winter feed. The general store is debating whether to extend credit, all because of you. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She'd known there might be personal consequences to her choices, but she hadn't considered how deeply they might affect Sam and the ranch. Is this true? She asked Sam quietly. He nodded grimly. Hiram at the bank mentioned some concerns yesterday. Nothing definite yet. Then you should do exactly what you think is right. Sam interrupted. Don't let them bully you into their choices. Theodore laughed harshly. Listen to him, defending her even as she ruins him. She has bewitched you. McKenna, no man in his right mind would sacrifice his ranch for a sharp-tongued spinster. Something shifted in Sam's expression. Margaret had seen him angry before, but this was different. A cold, controlled fury that made even the ranch hands step back. Get off my land, he said quietly. Now see here, Chester began. I said get off my land. Sam's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone present. You've come here to threaten and intimidate a woman under my protection. You've insulted her character without cause, and you've tried to blackmail me into abandoning someone who's shown nothing but dedication to this ranch. So I'll say it one more time. Get off my land before I help you off. You're making a mistake, Agnes warned. We represent the entire town. Stand with her, and you stand alone." "Then I stand alone," Sam said simply. Will Hartley stepped forward. "Not alone, boss." Maria emerged from behind the laundry lines. "Not alone." One by one, the ranch hands moved to stand with Sam and Margaret. Even Jake Porter, who'd been nothing but difficult since her arrival, spat his tobacco juice at Chester Morrison's horse's feet and crossed his arms in solidarity. Agnes Whitmore's face went pale with rage. "You'll all regret this. Mark my words. You'll regret choosing her over respectability." "Respectability?" Sam laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You call this respectable? Riding out here mob-handed to threaten a woman, trying to ruin a man's business because he won't bow to your prejudices. If that's respectability, I'll take scandal any day." The delegation retreated in disordered fashion, Agnes's purple feathers bobbing indignantly as her carriage lurched away. Theodore and Chester lingered a moment longer, shooting dark looks at Margaret before following. As the dust settled, Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the show of support. These people, some of whom had barely tolerated her presence 2 weeks ago, had stood with her against the town's pressure. I don't know what to say," she managed. "Nothing to say," Jake said gruffly. "Can't have outsiders telling us who can work here. Sets a bad precedent." "Besides," Tom added with a grin, "who else would know which chickens we can eat?" The tension broke, and several of the hands chuckled, but Margaret couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. "They were serious about the threats," she said to Sam as the others dispersed. "The bank, the suppliers, they could ruin you." "Maybe," Sam acknowledged. "But running a ranch is about more than money and credit. It's about principles. Can't build something worth having if you abandon those at the first sign of trouble." "But the winter feed. We'll figure it out. Always do." He paused, studying her face. "Unless you're having second thoughts. I wouldn't blame you if you were. This isn't your fight." Margaret thought about it. Really thought about it. She could leave now, find another town, start over where her reputation hadn't preceded her. It would be easier, safer, more practical. But she looked around at the ranch that had become home in just 2 weeks. At Maria, who'd taught her to make tortillas and called her Mija. At the ranch hands who'd gradually accepted her presence and even defended it. At Sam, who'd stood against the entire town rather than bow to their demands. "It is my fight," she said firmly. "I've worked too hard to run now because Agnes Whitmore clutches her pearls at the sight of a woman in working clothes." Sam smiled, not his usual wry half-smile, but something fuller and warmer. "Then we'd better get to work. Ranch doesn't run itself, scandal or no scandal," as if to emphasize his point. One of the horses in the corral chose that moment to kick down a section of fence, sending boards flying. "I'll get the tools," Will called out, but Margaret was already moving. "Wait," she said, pulling out her notebook. "This is the 3rd time this week that section's been damaged. I think the problem is the gate placement. The horses cluster there because it's the shortest path to water, creating stress on those particular boards." Jake rolled his eyes. Here we go again with the theories. But Margaret was already sketching a diagram. "If we move the gate 15 feet south and reinforce the corners here and here, it should distribute the pressure more evenly." Sam leaned over to look at her sketch, close enough that she could smell the leather and soap scent of him. "That actually makes sense. Don't sound so surprised," she said dryly. "Jake, Tom, help Will move that gate." Sam ordered, "Let's try Miss Sullivan's way." As the men set to work, grumbling good-naturedly about know-it-all Eastern women and their fancy ideas, Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. They might face closed doors in town, might struggle to secure winter supplies, might be the subject of scandal and gossip. But here on the ranch, she was making a difference. "Thank you," she said quietly to Sam as they watched the work progress. "For standing up to them, for standing with me. Like I said, principles matter." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Besides, you're the best hand I've hired in years." "Be bad business to let Agnes Whitmore run you off." It was couched in practical terms. But Margaret heard what he wasn't saying. In 2 weeks, she'd gone from being a temporary solution to a valued part of the ranch's operation. More than that, she'd become someone worth defending, someone worth standing against the town for. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the earth and burning off the last of the dawn chill. There was work to be done, fences to mend, cattle to tend, accounts to balance, and now suppliers to find who wouldn't bow to Agnes Whitmore's pressure. Margaret Sullivan, mail-order bride reject, too stubborn for her own good, stood in the yard of the McKenna Ranch and felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. The town might close its doors to her. Agnes Whitmore might scheme and threaten. But here, with dirt under her nails and the sun on her face, surrounded by people who valued work over whispers, she was home, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone, proprietous women in purple dresses or bitter rejected men, take that away from her. "Come on," Sam said, touching her elbow gently. "Maria's making breakfast, and we've got a long day ahead. Time to show Willow Creek what a ranch run by scandal can accomplish." Margaret smiled, tucking her notebook away. "Let them talk," she said, echoing his earlier words. "We've got work to do." As they headed toward the house, she heard Jake grudgingly admit that her gate idea was not completely stupid, which from him was high praise indeed. The ranch was already adapting to the morning's crisis, resilient as the land itself. Whatever came next, closed credit, hostile suppliers, social ostracism, they'd face it the way they faced everything else, together, with stubborn determination and the unshakable belief that principles mattered more than propriety. Margaret Sullivan had been rejected as too stubborn for marriage. But here on Sam McKenna's ranch, stubbornness wasn't a flaw to be corrected. It was a strength to be celebrated. The drought had started 3 weeks after Agnes Whitmore's delegation left the ranch. At first, it seemed like just another dry spell, common enough in Texas summers, but as days turned to weeks without rain, the creek that fed the ranch began to dwindle, and the grass turned brown and brittle under the relentless sun. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Sam and Will return from checking the water levels. Their faces were grim, and she could guess the news before they spoke. "How bad?" she asked as they entered, pouring fresh water from the pitcher she'd carefully rationed. "Creek's down to a trickle," Will said, accepting the cup gratefully. "At this rate, we'll be dry within the week." Sam removed his hat, running a hand through his dust-caked hair. "The north well's already failed, the south one's holding, but barely." Margaret's mind was already working through the implications. How many head can we sustain with just the south well? "Maybe half," Sam admitted. "If we're careful. Then we need to sell the rest immediately, before the other ranchers realize how desperate we are." Will shook his head. "Can't. Agnes Whitmore's made sure of that. Nobody in 3 counties will buy McKenna cattle. Say they won't do business with a ranch that harbors, well, you know what they say." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Margaret's shoulders. The drought was nature's cruelty, but the inability to sell cattle? That was her fault. Her presence had closed those doors. "I should leave," she said quietly. "If I go, maybe—" "Don't!" Sam's voice was sharp. "Don't even think it. This isn't your doing, isn't it? They won't buy from you because of me. They won't buy from me because they're small-minded fools," Sam corrected. "That's on them, not you." Before the argument could continue, the sound of running feet interrupted. Tom burst through the door, face flushed with exertion and fear. "Boss, rustlers hitting the east pasture. They're making off with the yearlings." Sam was moving before Tom finished speaking, strapping on his gun belt. "How many?" "6, maybe 7 riders. Jake and the boys are trying to hold them, but—" A distant gunshot cracked across the prairie, followed by another. "Stay here," Sam ordered Margaret, then was gone. Will and Tom at his heels. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, orders warring with instinct. Then another shot rang out, and decision crystallized. She grabbed the medical supplies she'd organized, along with the old Navy Colt Sam had taught her to shoot, and ran for the stable. Maria appeared as Margaret was saddling her horse. "What are you doing, Mija?" "They might need help. Medical help," Margaret added at Maria's skeptical look. "You ever been in a gunfight?" "No, but I've treated gunshot wounds at the factory. Industrial accidents." Margaret's hands were steady as she checked the cylinder. "I won't be useless." Maria studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Take Dancer. He's gun broke. And Mija, don't get yourself killed. Sam would never forgive himself." Margaret mounted and rode hard toward the sound of gunfire, her heart pounding but her mind clear. The east pasture spread before her, dust clouds marking where riders wheeled and fought. She could see the rustlers trying to drive a group of cattle toward the canyon, while Sam's men fought to stop them. A figure lay motionless on the ground. Jake. Without thinking, Margaret spurred her horse forward, keeping low in the saddle as Sam had taught her. Bullets whined overhead, but she focused on reaching Jake. She dropped from the saddle beside him, relieved to see his chest rising and falling. Blood soaked his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. "Damn fool woman." Jake groaned as she pressed a bandage to the wound. "Gonna get yourself shot?" "Probably," Margaret agreed, working quickly. "But you'll bleed to death if I don't do this, so perhaps save the scolding for later." A rider bore down on them, one of the rustlers, face masked by a bandana. Margaret's hand found the Colt, and she fired without conscious thought. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make the rustler veer off. "You missed," Jake observed. "I was aiming for his horse." Margaret lied, trying to stop her hands from shaking. The battle was turning. Sam and Will had rallied the hands, driving the rustlers back. But the thieves had done damage. Several cattle were down, and at least one had made it to the canyon with a dozen head. As the remaining rustlers fled, Sam galloped to where Margaret knelt beside Jake. His face was thunderous. "I told you to stay at the house, and Jake would be dead if I had." She shot back. "Save the lecture. We need to get him back." For a moment, she thought he'd continue the argument. Then he dismounted, helping her fashion a travois from rope and blankets. Together they got Jake secured for transport. "I know that wound," Jake said suddenly, his voice weak but certain. "The rider you shot at, I winged him in the arm. Saw blood on his sleeve when he turned. Plenty of men might have arm wounds," Will said. But Jake shook his head. "The way he sat his horse, the silver conchos on his saddle. Boss, I think it was Chester Morrison." Shocked silence greeted this announcement. "You're sure?" Sam asked. "Sure as I can be without seeing his face." But that palomino of his would stand out too much. He was riding a bay, but the tack was his. Margaret felt cold despite the heat. He's escalating. First social pressure, then economic, now outright theft. "Can't prove it," Will pointed out. "Even if Jake's right, no lawman in 3 counties would arrest Chester Morrison on the word of ranch hands from a scandal-ridden operation." They made a somber procession back to the ranch. Margaret rode beside the travois, monitoring Jake's condition, while her mind wrestled with the implications. The drought, the closed markets, and now rustlers, likely sent by their enemies. How much more could the ranch withstand? Back at the house, she worked on Jake's wound with the focused intensity that had served her in the factories. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing major vessels. He'd recover, though he'd be laid up for weeks. "Never figured you for a nurse," Jake said as she finished the bandaging. "Never figured you for a patient," she replied. "Yet here we are." He caught her hand as she turned to go. "I was wrong about you, miss. Been wrong since the day you arrived. You've got sand, and that matters more than anything else out here." Coming from Jake, who'd been her fiercest critic, the words meant everything. Margaret squeezed his hand briefly, then bustled out before emotion could overwhelm her. She found Sam on the porch, staring out at the dusty landscape. The stolen cattle were gone, the wounded were tended, but the larger problems remained. "How many did we lose?" she asked, sitting beside him. 15 head, maybe 20. Could have been worse." He glanced at her. "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, so put yourself in danger." Yes, I saved Jake's life. Possibly. He sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I can't decide whether to thank you or turn you over my knee. I'd advise the former, Margaret said dryly. I still have that colt. Despite everything, he smiled. Margaret Sullivan, you are without a doubt the most troublesome woman I've ever met. Flatterer. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The ranch looked peaceful in the golden light, belying the day's violence and the threats that pressed in from all sides. We can't go on like this, Margaret said finally. The drought, the rustlers, the closed markets. Something has to give. I know. Sam's voice was heavy. I've been thinking. There's water in the hill country, natural springs that don't dry up. If we could move the herd there. But it's a 2-day drive through open country. Perfect opportunity for rustlers to hit us again. And we'd need supplies for the journey, which means dealing with merchants who won't sell to us. Margaret's notebook appeared in her hands. She'd taken to carrying it everywhere. What if we didn't buy from local merchants? What do you mean? There's a new settlement, 40 miles south, Oakwood. They're hungry for business. Probably don't know or care about Willow Creek's social dramas. She showed him figures she'd been working on. If we sent a wagon with a small escort, we could get supplies there. That's a 4-day round trip, risky. Everything's risky now. She met his eyes steadily. But if we can get the herd to water, we can outlast our enemies. The drought will break eventually. And when it does, we'll still be standing. Sam studied her notes, his expression thoughtful. You've been planning this for a while. Since the first week of drought. I hoped we wouldn't need it, but... She gestured at the parched landscape. All right, we'll send Will and 2 men to Oakwood tomorrow. If they can get supplies, we'll move the herd to the hill country. He paused. On one condition. What's that? You stay here when we move the cattle. No arguments, he added as she opened her mouth. It's too dangerous. Today proved that. Today proved I can handle myself when needed. Today proved you're brave to the point of foolishness. But this is different. A cattle drive through hostile territory with rustlers waiting. I won't risk you like that. Margaret wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was something there beyond professional concern, something that made her pulse quicken. I'll stay, she agreed reluctantly. But I'm planning every detail of that drive, routes, supplies, contingencies, everything. I wouldn't expect anything less. That night, Margaret worked late by lamplight, mapping water sources and calculating supplies. Maria brought her coffee and sat quietly mending while Margaret planned. You love him, Maria said suddenly. Margaret's pen skittered across the page. What? Sam, you love him, and he loves you, though he's too stubborn to say it. Maria, we have a business arrangement. Mija, I've seen business arrangements. They don't involve facing down rustlers or standing against the whole town. Maria's eyes were kind but knowing. They don't involve looking at each other the way you two do. Margaret set down her pen, her hands trembling slightly. Even if you're right, it doesn't matter. I've brought him nothing but trouble. His ranch is suffering because of me. His ranch is suffering because evil men want to control him. That's not your fault. Maria reached across to pat Margaret's hand. Besides, the ranch was dying slowly before you came. Just Sam and his grief. Working himself to death. You brought life back here. I brought scandal and rustlers. You brought purpose, hope, love, if you're both brave enough to claim it. Maria stood, gathering her mending. Think about it, Mija. What's the point of saving the ranch if there's no joy in living on it? After Maria left, Margaret sat alone with her thoughts. Through the window, she could see a light burning in the main house where Sam was probably doing his own planning. They were 2 stubborn people fighting against drought and prejudice and violent men. But they were fighting together. And maybe, if they were very lucky and very brave, they'd find more than just survival on the other side. The knock on her door interrupted her musings. Sam stood there, looking oddly uncertain. Thought you should know. Jake's asking for you. Says he remembered something else about the rustlers. It was clearly an excuse, but Margaret didn't call him on it. I'll come immediately. As they walked across the yard under a canopy of stars, Sam cleared his throat. What you did today. I was angry, but I was also proud. You've got more courage than most men I know. Stubborn, you mean? That too. He stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. Margaret, I need to say something before whatever happens next. Her heart began to race. Sam! No, let me finish. These past weeks, watching you take on every challenge, seeing you stand firm when the whole world tells you to bend, you've made me remember what it feels like to hope again, to want things beyond just surviving another day. He reached out, his calloused fingers gentle as they brushed a stray hair from her face. I know I've got no right to speak, given our arrangement, but if we make it through this, when we make it through this, I'd like to court you properly, if you'd have me. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. All her life, men had wanted to change her, tame her, make her into something more acceptable, but Sam McKenna saw her stubbornness as strength, her defiance as courage. I'd have you, she whispered. Drought, rustlers, Agnes Whitmore and all. He smiled then, that full, transformative smile she'd seen so rarely. Then we'd better make sure we survive this. Be ashamed to waste a good courtship on account of being dead. She laughed despite everything. The danger, the uncertainty, the challenges that pressed in from all sides. Very practical. Mr. McKenna. I'm learning from the best, Miss Sullivan. They stood there a moment longer, two souls finding each other against all odds. Then duty called, and they continued to the bunkhouse where Jake waited with his information. Tomorrow would bring new battles, the trip to Oakwood, the cattle drive, the continued hostility of their enemies. But tonight, Margaret Sullivan had something she'd never expected to find when she'd stepped off that dusty stagecoach. She had a future worth fighting for, and fight she would, with every stubborn, difficult, troublesome bone in her body. The thunderclouds had been building all morning, dark and promising against the horizon. Margaret stood in the ranch yard, her arms full of freshly gathered eggs, watching the sky with a mixture of hope and apprehension. 3 days had passed since Sam left with the herd for the hill country. 3 days of waiting and worrying while she and Maria kept the ranch running with a skeleton crew. Storm coming, Maria said, joining her. Big one, by the looks of it. Margaret nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The cattle drive should be returning today if all had gone well. If it hadn't, she pushed the thought away and focused on immediate concerns. We should secure everything we can. If this breaks the drought, it'll come hard. They worked through the morning, battening down loose boards, moving equipment under cover, preparing for nature's fury. The air grew thick and electric, making the horses restless and the chickens huddle in their coop. It was past noon when Tom came riding hard from his lookout position, his horse lathered with sweat. Riders coming, he shouted. Lots of them. Margaret's heart leaped, then plummeted. Sam? Can't tell yet, but Miss Sullivan... Tom's face was grim. There's another group coming from the east. Looks like they're aiming to intercept. Without hesitation, Margaret ran for the house, Maria at her heels. They'd prepared for this possibility. Sam had insisted on it before leaving. Margaret grabbed the rifle from its place by the door while Maria began loading ammunition. How many? Margaret asked Tom as he dismounted. Maybe a dozen from the east, armed. He paused. I think I saw Chester Morrison's Palomino. So their enemies were making their move, timing it when the ranch was most vulnerable. Margaret felt a cold fury settle in her chest. They'd driven Sam to risk everything on this cattle drive, and now they sought to destroy him entirely. Tom, ride to town. Get the sheriff. Sheriff won't come, Tom said bitterly. Not for us. Then get whoever will... The doctor, the minister, anyone with a conscience. She checked the rifle's action with hands steadier than her heart. Tell them Chester Morrison's about to commit murder in broad daylight. See if their respectability stretches that far." Tom remounted and galloped away. Margaret positioned herself on the porch, Maria beside her with the shotgun, the two remaining hands, Jake still recovering from his wound, and young Daniel, who'd drawn the short straw, took positions by the barn. The riders from the east arrived first, spreading out in a semicircle before the house. Chester Morrison sat at their center, no longer bothering to hide his identity. Beside him rode Theodore Blackwood and several hard-looking men Margaret didn't recognize. "Miss Sullivan," Chester called out mockingly. "All alone? How unfortunate." "Not alone," Margaret replied, making sure they could see the rifle. "And not unprepared. Now, no need for violence." Chester's smile was cold. "We're here on business. Seems Sam McKenna owes considerable money to various creditors. We're here to collect. With guns drawn? How civilized." Theodore spoke up. "The guns are merely precautionary. After all, this ranch harbors a dangerous woman, one who shoots at innocent visitors." "The only danger here is to thieves and rustlers," Margaret said clearly. "Which are you claiming to be, Mr. Blackwood?" Before he could respond, a rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. The storm was moving in fast, and in the distance, Margaret could see a dust cloud that had to be the returning herd. Chester saw it too. "Ah, perfect timing. We'll just relieve Sam of those cattle in payment of his debts. Very convenient." "What debts?" Margaret demanded. "Sam owes nothing to any of you." "Oh, but he does." Chester produced a paper from his coat. "Bought up his notes from the bank. That makes me his creditor. And since he's clearly unable to pay—" Margaret's mind raced. It was a lie. Had to be. Sam had been current on his loans. But with the bank under Agnes Whitmore's influence, who would contradict Chester's claim? "I want to see that paper," she said. "Certainly. Just put down the rifle and come get it." Another rumble of thunder. Closer now. The wind was picking up, whipping dust across the yard. In the distance, the returning herd was becoming visible, along with their outriders. But Chester's men were already moving to intercept. That's when Margaret saw her, Agnes Whitmore, sitting in a carriage just behind the horsemen. The woman who'd orchestrated all of this from the shadows, finally come to witness her triumph. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret called out. "Come to watch your handiwork? Too cowardly to get your own hands dirty?" Agnes's face flushed. "You destroyed the moral fabric of our community. This is simply the consequence. This is theft and attempted murder." Margaret shot back. "And you're complicit in all of it." "Enough talk," Chester said, his patience exhausted. He gestured to his men. "Take her." What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Chester's men started forward. Margaret raised her rifle. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Then Sam's voice rang out across the prairie. "That's far enough." The returning cowboys had spread out, flanking Chester's group. Sam himself rode at the front, his face set in hard lines. Will was beside him, along with several hands Margaret didn't recognize. Men from Oakwood, she realized, hired to help with the drive. "McKenna," Chester said, trying to maintain his bravado. "We're here on legitimate business." "Legitimate?" Sam laughed harshly. "You mean like the legitimate business of rustling my cattle? Jake identified you. Morrison, that wounded arm give you any trouble?" Chester's left arm did indeed show stiffness as he shifted in his saddle. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. "You can't prove anything," Theodore blustered. "Maybe not." Sam agreed. "But I can prove this. I paid off my bank loans in full yesterday. Cash money from the cattle I sold in Oakwood." He produced his own papers, wrapped in oilcloth against the rain. "Your forged documents won't hold up against these receipts." The rain was falling harder now. Large drops that promised the drought's end. Chester's men looked uncertain, water streaming from their hat brims. "It's over," Sam continued. "You've lost. I've got buyers in Oakwood who don't care about your petty prejudices. My ranch is solvent. And if you don't get off my land right now, I'll press charges for rustling, fraud, and attempted robbery. You wouldn't dare." Agnes Whitmore shrilled from her carriage. "No court would take your word over ours." That's when new riders appeared on the horizon. Tom, returning with a small group from town. Margaret recognized Dr. Holcomb, Reverend Mills, and surprisingly, Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house. "Actually, Doctor," Holcomb said as they drew near, "I think a court would be very interested in what we just witnessed. Attempted robbery in broad daylight. And I," Reverend Mills added, "would be happy to testify about the systematic harassment this ranch has endured. It's gone far beyond proper Christian correction into outright persecution." Mrs. Patterson, of all people, spoke last. "I've held my tongue too long, letting Agnes Whitmore speak for all respectable women, but this is beyond the pale. That young woman has done nothing but work honestly and defend herself against unwanted advances. If that makes her unsuitable, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we're suited for." The tide had turned. Faced with witnesses, including pillars of the community, Chester's bravado crumbled. His hired guns, recognizing the shift, began to edge away. "This isn't over," Chester snarled, but his threat lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Sam said flatly. "You're done here. Morrison, you too, Blackwood, and Mrs. Whitmore. Your reign as moral arbiter of Willow Creek just ended." The rain came in earnest then, a deluge that sent everyone scattering. Chester and his group retreated in disorder, Agnes Whitmore's carriage getting stuck in rapidly forming mud. The witnesses from town took shelter in the barn, while Sam's cowboys drove the cattle into the secured pastures. Margaret stood on the porch, rifle still in hand, watching their enemies flee. The drought was breaking, the ranch was saved, and the town's stranglehold on their lives was shattered. She should feel triumphant. Instead, she felt exhausted. Sam dismounted and climbed the steps to stand beside her. He was soaked through, muddy, and had never looked better to her eyes. "You all right?" he asked softly. "I am now." She set the rifle aside and turned to face him. "How did you manage to pay off the loans?" "The buyers in Oakwood were generous. Seems they'd heard about a ranch with innovative water management and detailed breeding records, paid premium prices." He smiled. "Your notebook came in very handy during negotiations." "My notebook?" "The one where you'd cataloged every animal, noted their traits, tracked their productivity. Turns out buyers appreciate that kind of detailed information." "Who knew?" "Despite everything," Margaret laughed. "Are you saying my stubborn insistence on record-keeping saved the ranch?" "I'm saying you saved the ranch. Your planning, your courage, your refusal to bend when everyone said you should." He reached out, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "Margaret Sullivan, you magnificent, troublesome woman!" "Sam," she whispered, but whatever she meant to say was lost as he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and victorious and full of promise. There in the pouring rain with their enemies vanquished and their future finally clear, Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck, not caring who saw, not caring about propriety or scandal or anything but this moment. When they finally broke apart, the yard had filled with people. The cowboys were whooping and hollering. Maria was crying happy tears. Even Jake, limping from the bunkhouse, was grinning. "Doctor." Holcomb cleared his throat. "I believe congratulations are in order for the ranch's success." Of course, Sam agreed, but his arm stayed firmly around Margaret's waist. "And perhaps for other things as well, Miss Sullivan. Would you do me the honor of making our arrangement permanent? Will you marry me?" Margaret looked up at him, this man who'd seen her at her most stubborn and called it strength, who'd stood against a town for her, who'd trusted her intelligence and valued her opinions. "That depends," she said seriously. "Will I still get to name the chickens?" He laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "You can name every animal on the ranch if you want. You can implement any system, argue any point, be as stubborn and difficult as you've ever been. Just say yes." "Then yes," she said simply. Yes, to all of it. The cheer that went up could probably be heard in town, in the middle of it all, as the rain washed away months of drought and years of prejudice. Margaret Sullivan, soon to be McKenna, stood in the arms of the man who'd claimed her, not despite her stubborn nature, but because of it. The minister was right there, after all. And as the storm passed and the sun broke through, painting rainbows across the Texas sky, they made it official. No fancy church wedding, no elaborate dress, just two people who'd found each other against all odds, surrounded by friends who'd stood with them when it mattered. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Mills said, raising his voice over the rain. "Mr. McKenna, you may kiss your bride. My stubborn, difficult, perfect bride," Sam murmured, and kissed her again while the ranch celebrated around them. Later, there would be consequences to face. Chester Morrison would slink away to nurse his wounds and his reputation. Theodore Blackwood would find that treating women as property had cost him any chance at happiness. Agnes Whitmore would discover that moral authority, once lost, was impossible to regain. But that was for later. Now, in this moment, Margaret stood with her husband on the ranch they'd saved together, watching the rain bring life back to the parched land. She'd traveled 1,000 miles expecting one life and found another entirely. She'd been rejected as too stubborn for marriage. Thank God for that rejection. It had led her here, to a man who saw her strength as a gift rather than a flaw, to a life where she could be exactly who she was. The rain fell, the cattle lowed, and somewhere in the chicken coop, Henrietta, the best laying hen in Texas, according to Margaret's careful records, settled in for the night. All was well at the McKenna Ranch. The Harvest Festival had always been Willow Creek's biggest event of the year. Merchants displayed their finest goods. Ranchers showed off their best livestock, and the whole county gathered to celebrate the season's bounty. This year, 6 months after the drought broke and the McKenna Ranch's fortunes turned, the festival carried special significance. Margaret McKenna stood before the mirror in their bedroom, adjusting the brooch at her throat. She wore a new dress, forest green that brought out her eyes, practical but elegant. Sam appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "We don't have to go." "We're going," Margaret said firmly. "The ranch has the finest cattle in 3 counties thanks to our breeding program. Why should we hide that because of old gossip?" Sam smiled against her neck. "That's my stubborn wife." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Ma'am?" It was Tom's voice. "The wagon's loaded with the preserves and the quilts for the competition, and the ledgers for the agricultural display." Margaret called back, "Don't forget those." She heard Tom mutter something about only woman who'd bring bookkeeping to a festival, but his tone was affectionate. The ranch hands had long since accepted that Margaret's detailed records were part of what made their operation successful. As they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed Sam strapping on his gun belt, expecting trouble. "Not expecting it," he said carefully, "but Chester Morrison's been too quiet lately. Makes me nervous." They'd heard rumors that Morrison's ranch was struggling. His brutal management style had driven away good hands. And without Margaret's systematic approach or Sam's work ethic, the double bar was slowly failing. Theodore Blackwood had left town entirely, his marriage prospects ruined by his public behavior. But Agnes Whitmore remained, diminished but still spiteful. The ride to town was pleasant, their wagon joining others on the road. Several neighbors nodded greetings, a marked change from the cold shoulders of months past. The Oakwood buyers had spread word of the McKenna Ranch's quality cattle and innovative practices, and success had a way of changing minds. Still, Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest as they entered Willow Creek. Some wounds healed slowly. The festival grounds were bustling with activity. Booths lined the main square. Children ran between the displays, and the smell of fresh-baked pies filled the air. Margaret had entered the preserves competition and the quilt exhibition. Maria had taught her well, but her real purpose was the agricultural display. Well, the scandalous Mrs. McKenna graces us with her presence. Margaret turned to find Agnes Whitmore standing nearby, surrounded by a small group of women. The former social leader looked older, her face lined with bitterness. Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret acknowledged coolly. How nice to see you supporting the festival. I always support community events. Agnes sniffed. Unlike some, who only appear when they have something to gain. Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Patterson approached. The boarding house owner had become an unexpected ally since the confrontation at the ranch. Margaret, dear, I've been hoping to see your quilt entry. I hear you've developed quite a skill. She turned to Agnes with a smile sharp as glass. Productivity suits our Margaret so well, don't you think? Unlike idleness and gossip. Agnes flushed and retreated with her diminished circle. Mrs. Patterson watched her go with satisfaction. Thank you, Margaret said quietly. Nonsense. I should have spoken up months ago. That woman's held this town under her thumb for too long. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled. Besides, I have a business proposition. My niece in Oakwood wants to learn modern bookkeeping. I thought perhaps you might take on a student. Before Margaret could answer, a commotion erupted near the livestock pens. Raised voices, a woman's scream, the sound of splintering wood. Sam was already moving. Margaret close behind. They found chaos. A bull had broken free from its pen and was rampaging through the festival grounds. People scattered in panic as the massive animal charged through booths, destroying displays and threatening anyone in its path. That's Morrison's bull, Sam said grimly. Red Devil, he calls it. Mean as sin and twice as dangerous. Indeed, Chester Morrison stood near the broken pen, but he made no move to control his animal. If anything, he looked satisfied by the destruction. The bull wheeled, its eyes fixed on a group of children frozen with fear near the pie booth. Margaret's heart stopped as she recognized one of them, little Emma Holcomb, the doctor's daughter who'd been kind to her at church. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a red tablecloth from a nearby booth and ran forward, placing herself between the bull and the children. Margaret, no! Sam shouted, but she was already moving. She snapped the cloth like a matador's cape, drawing the bull's attention. Over here, you overgrown steer! The bull charged. Margaret stepped aside at the last moment, using the cloth to guide its momentum past her. The children scattered to safety, but now she had 800 pounds of angry beef focused entirely on her. The water trough, she called to Sam, who was circling to help. Drive him toward the trough. Together they worked, Margaret with her makeshift cape and Sam with a rope he'd grabbed, corralling the bull toward the large water trough at the center of the square. Other men joined them. Will, Tom, even Jake limping determinedly with a pole. Just as the bull seemed ready to charge again, a shot rang out. The bull bellowed and stumbled, a dart protruding from its flank. Doctor. Holcomb stood with his medical bag, holding a modified syringe. Sedative, he explained as the bull's legs began to wobble. Been carrying it since Morrison started bringing that monster to town. The bull collapsed with a ground-shaking thud, unconscious but breathing. The crowd that had scattered began to gather again, murmuring with amazement and relief. Margaret! Emma Holcomb broke free from her mother and ran to Margaret, throwing her small arms around her skirts. You saved us! Anyone would have done the same, Margaret said, though her knees felt weak now that the danger had passed. No. Doctor, Holcomb said firmly, arriving to check on his daughter. Not anyone. That took extraordinary courage. Chester Morrison finally appeared, his face twisted with fury. You had no right to drug my animal. I'll sue for damages. Your animal that you failed to properly secure. Sam stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. Your animal that nearly killed children because you were too proud or too incompetent to pen it correctly. It was an accident, like the rustling was an accident, like trying to steal our ranch was an accident. Sam's voice rose. We've tolerated your presence, Morrison, but no more. You're not welcome in this town. You can't run me out. I own property. Mortgaged property. A new voice interjected. It was Hiram Watts from the bank. looking stern. "Property you've mismanaged into the ground. Your notes were called in yesterday. Morrison. You have 30 days to pay in full or face foreclosure." Chester's face went white. "You can't do this!" "I can, and I have. Your reputation for dishonesty has finally caught up with you." The banker turned to Sam and Margaret. "I owe you both an apology. I let myself be influenced by prejudice instead of looking at facts. Your ranch is one of our most reliable accounts, while Morrison here hasn't made a payment in months." As Chester slunk away, defeated at last, the crowd began to disperse. But then someone started clapping. It was Reverend Mills, his face beaming. Others joined in, and soon the entire square rang with applause. Margaret stood frozen, overwhelmed. These people who had shunned her, gossiped about her, tried to drive her away, they were applauding her courage. "Speech," someone called out. "Let's hear from our hero." "I'm no hero," Margaret protested, but they wouldn't be denied. She found herself pushed toward the festival platform, Sam's encouraging hand at her back, standing before the crowd. Margaret saw all of Willow Creek gathered, those who'd been kind, those who'd been cruel, those who'd simply watched and waited. She thought of all the words she could say, all the justified anger she could express. Instead, she spoke from her heart. 6 months ago, I stood in this town as a stranger, rejected and alone. I was called too stubborn, too difficult, unsuitable for the life expected of me. Her voice grew stronger. And they were right. I was all of those things. I still am. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she continued. But I've learned that stubbornness can be another word for determination. That difficulty can mean refusing to accept injustice. That being unsuitable for one life might mean you're perfectly suited for another. She found Sam in the crowd, his eyes warm with pride. "This town taught me hard lessons. Some of you showed me cruelty, yes, but others showed me kindness when it cost you to do so. And today, we all stood together to protect our children. That's what community truly means. Not conformity, not blind adherence to what's always been, but coming together when it matters most." She paused, looking directly at Agnes Whitmore and her remaining followers. "I'm still stubborn. I still keep detailed records that drive my ranch hands half mad. I still believe women deserve choices and respect. I still name my chickens." That earned a laugh from the crowd. "But I'm also your neighbor. I'm part of this community, whether some like it or not, and I'll defend it, and you, with every stubborn bone in my body." The applause this time was thunderous. People surged forward to shake her hand, to thank her, to apologize for past behavior. "Doctor," Holcomb's wife embraced her tearfully. "Mrs." Patterson declared loudly that Margaret was exactly the kind of woman Willow Creek needed more of. Even Agnes Whitmore approached, her face a battlefield of emotions. I was wrong," she said stiffly. "Your actions today showed true Christian virtue." It wasn't much of an apology, but from Agnes, it was monumental. Margaret nodded graciously. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Whitmore. What matters is what we do next." The festival continued with renewed energy. Margaret's preserves won second place. Mrs. Patterson's strawberry jam took first, to no one's surprise. And her quilt received an honorable mention. But the real triumph came at the agricultural display. Rancher after rancher studied her detailed breeding records, amazed by the systematic approach that had improved the McKenna herd so dramatically. By day's end, she had 3 offers to consult on bookkeeping and 5 requests for breeding stock from their best bulls. As the sun set and lanterns were lit for the evening dance, Margaret found herself surrounded by neighbors who now saw her not as a threat to their way of life, but as an asset to their community. The transformation wasn't complete. Some still whispered, some still disapproved, but the tide had definitively turned. Sam pulled her into his arms as the music started. "How does it feel to be the hero of Willow Creek?" "Exhausting," Margaret admitted, resting her head against his chest. "I think I prefer being scandalous. It was less work," he laughed, spinning her around the makeshift dance floor. "Too late now. You've gone and shown them who you really are. And who's that? He considered. Margaret McKenna. Too stubborn to fail, too brave to back down, too smart to let anyone put her in a box. My wife, who faces down bulls and gossips with equal courage. You forgot chicken namer and obsessive record keeper. Those two. He agreed solemnly. Can't forget the important parts. They danced as the stars came out, surrounded by a community that had finally begun to see strength where they'd once seen scandal. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely provided those, but it was real and earned and theirs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The ranch would continue to grow under their joint management. Margaret would take on students, teaching other women the skills that had helped save the McKenna Ranch. Sam would work with neighboring ranchers, sharing the innovations that Margaret's systematic approach had brought. But tonight, they danced. The woman who'd been rejected as too stubborn, and the man who'd claimed her anyway, proving to all of Willow Creek that sometimes the very qualities that make someone unsuitable for one life make them perfect for another. As the fiddle played and couples swirled around them, Margaret thought she could hear Henrietta the chicken squawking indignantly back at the ranch, probably upset that her evening routine had been disrupted. The thought made her smile. She was Margaret McKenna, wife, rancher, hero of the hour, and yes, still proudly, unrepentantly stubborn, and she wouldn't have it any other way. The autumn sun painted the McKenna Ranch in shades of gold and amber, a fitting backdrop for the first anniversary of Margaret's arrival in Willow Creek. She stood on the porch of the main house, their house now, watching the bustling activity in the yard below. So much had changed in a year, yet some things remained constant. "Henrietta's escaped again," Maria called out, chasing the rebellious chicken past the water trough that now efficiently irrigated their expanded garden. Margaret smiled. "Third time this week. I think she's trying to establish a new pecking order. Just like her owner," Sam said, coming up behind her with 2 cups of coffee, always shaking things up. She accepted the cup gratefully, leaning back against his solid warmth. "The students will be here soon. Are you sure you don't mind having the house overrun with young women learning bookkeeping?" "Mind? Margaret, half the ranches in the county are thriving because their wives learned your methods. We're performing a public service." It was true. What had started with Mrs. Patterson's niece had grown into a proper school of sorts. Young women came from as far as Austin to learn the systematic approach that had transformed the McKenna Ranch into one of the most successful operations in Texas. "Mrs. McKenna," a voice called from the road. "Mrs. McKenna, come quick." It was young Daniel, riding hard from town. Margaret set down her coffee, immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, ma'am, but there's news, big news. There's a man at the hotel, says he's from some newspaper back east. Wants to write about you." Margaret felt Sam tense beside her. They'd had enough of outsiders causing trouble. "What newspaper?" Sam asked carefully. "The Philadelphia Inquirer," he said. "Claims he heard about a woman who tamed the Wild West with ledger books and chicken names." Daniel was practically bouncing with excitement. "The whole town's talking about it." Margaret and Sam exchanged glances. Philadelphia, her hometown newspaper. "I suppose we should meet this journalist," Margaret said slowly. They rode into town to find Willow Creek in an unusual state of excitement. People clustered on street corners, and several shop owners had put out their best displays. Even Agnes Whitmore had donned her finest dress. Though she still looked somewhat sour about the attention Margaret was receiving, the journalist was waiting in the hotel parlor. A thin, earnest-looking man with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. McKenna." He jumped to his feet. "Josiah Hartwell, Philadelphia Inquirer. I've traveled a long way to meet the woman who's revolutionizing ranch management in Texas." Revolutionizing might be a strong word, Margaret said carefully. "Nonsense. I've been interviewing ranchers across 3 counties. Your methods have increased productivity by an average of 30%. Your breeding program has produced cattle that sell for premium prices, and you've done it all while fighting drought, rustlers, and social prejudice. "How did you hear about all this?" Sam asked, still protective. "A letter from a doctor. Holcomb, initially. But once I started investigating, the stories poured in. The mail-order bride who refused to be ordered. The woman who faced down bulls and bigots with equal courage. It's exactly the kind of story our readers crave, the American spirit triumphing over adversity." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your interest, but I'm just a rancher's wife who keeps good records." "Stop!" The voice was unexpected. Agnes Whitmore stepped forward, her expression determined. "Mr. Hartwell, if you're going to write about Margaret McKenna, you need to know the truth." Margaret braced herself, but Agnes's next words surprised everyone. "She is stubborn, impossibly, infuriatingly stubborn. She came to this town and refused to bend to our expectations, refused to accept the role we tried to force on her." Agnes paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "And thank God for it." The room fell silent. Agnes continued, her voice stronger. "I spent years telling women how they should behave, what they should accept, how small they should make themselves. Then Margaret Sullivan arrived and showed us another way. Yes, I fought her. Yes, I tried to drive her out, but she stood firm. And in doing so, she showed us all, especially those of us who needed to see it most, that strength comes in many forms." She turned to Margaret directly. "You asked me once what kind of woman refuses an unwanted marriage and chooses work instead. I know the answer now. The kind of woman this frontier needs. The kind we all need." "Mr." Hartwell was scribbling frantically. Others had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Dr. Holcomb and his wife, Reverend Mills, Mrs. Patterson, and many of the ranchers who'd adopted Margaret's methods. "If you want stories." "Doctor," Holcomb said, "I'll tell you about the woman who saved my daughter from a rampaging bull, then calmly attended the church picnic as if nothing had happened. She taught my wife to read." One rancher added, "Said every person should be able to verify their own accounts. Helped me reorganize my whole operation." Another chimed in, "Double my profits in 6 months." Story after story poured out, painting a picture of a woman who'd transformed not just a ranch, but an entire community. Mr. Hartwell's pencil flew across the pages, trying to capture it all. Finally, he turned to Margaret. "Mrs. McKenna, what would you like to say to the women back east who might be considering a similar journey?" Margaret looked around the room at these people who had become her community, those who'd opposed her and those who'd supported her, all now united in something approaching respect, if not affection. "I would tell them to be prepared," she said finally. "The West doesn't care about your fine manners or your delicate sensibilities. It will test every ounce of strength you possess." She paused, finding Sam's eyes across the room. "But I would also tell them that here, on this frontier, you can become who you truly are, not who society expects you to be, not who your family demands you become, but yourself, stubborn edges and all." "And if they're rejected?" Mr. Hartwell prompted. "If they're told they're too difficult, too opinionated, unsuitable for marriage?" Margaret smiled. "Then I'd say they're probably exactly where they need to be. The right person won't try to change you. They'll stand beside you and say to the world, 'That's my woman, stubbornness and all.'" Sam crossed the room to take her hand, facing the journalist. "For the record, Mr. Hartwell. I'd claim her again tomorrow and every day after. The very qualities that made others reject her are what made our ranch successful, our community stronger, and our life together worth living." The interview continued for hours, with more townspeople arriving to share their stories. By the time Mr. Hartwell finished, he had enough material for a series of articles, not just one. As they prepared to leave, he pulled Margaret aside. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I looked into Theodore Blackwood before I came. He's working as a clerk in Chicago, still unmarried, still bitter. He actually warned me against coming here, said you'd corrupted an entire town, and you came anyway." Because of how he said it, Any woman who could inspire that much fear in a small-minded man had to be worth meeting. He smiled. I wasn't disappointed. That evening, the ranch hosted an impromptu celebration. The students had arrived for their lessons but found themselves part of a larger gathering as neighbors stopped by to share in the day's excitement. Margaret stood by the corral, watching Sam demonstrate roping techniques to some of the younger students while Maria supervised an enormous meal preparation. Jake, now fully healed and one of Margaret's strongest supporters, was regaling a group with the story of how she'd saved his life during the Rustler attack. Quite a day, Will said, joining her. From rejected bride to newspaper sensation. Not bad for a year's work. It's not about the recognition, Margaret said. It's about proving that there's more than one way to live a worthy life. Still, Will grinned. Bet those folks back in Philadelphia who said a woman couldn't manage business affairs will choke on their morning coffee when they read Hartwell's articles. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant crimsons and purples, Sam called everyone to gather. He stood on the porch, Margaret beside him, addressing the assembled crowd. A year ago, a woman stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a trunk and her dignity. She was told she was too stubborn, too difficult, unsuitable for the life this town expected. He looked down at Margaret with unmistakable love. Today, that same woman has shown us all what determination can accomplish. She's transformed our ranch, influenced our community, and proven that sometimes the very qualities others call flaws are actually our greatest strengths. He raised his glass. To Margaret McKenna, teacher, innovator, bullfighter, chicken namer, and yes, the stubbornest woman in Texas. May she never change. To Margaret, the crowd echoed. Glasses and cups raised high. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she looked out at the gathering. These people had become her family, this land her home. The journey that began with rejection had led to acceptance, not because she'd changed to fit their expectations, but because she'd remained true to herself and shown them a different way. Speech, someone called out, and others took up the cry. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying clear in the evening air. When I came here, I thought I was coming to be someone's wife. What I found instead was the chance to be myself. Each of you, whether you fought me or supported me, helped me discover that the life we're meant to live isn't always the one we plan. She paused, seeing nods of understanding from many faces. So here's to the stubborn ones, the difficult ones, the ones who don't fit the mold. Here's to the men brave enough to stand beside us and the communities wise enough to eventually embrace us. Here's to choosing our own paths, even when, especially when, they lead through dusty Texas towns that don't know what to make of us. The applause was warm and genuine as the party continued around them. Sam pulled Margaret aside, leading her to their favorite spot overlooking the eastern pasture. No regrets? He asked softly. You could have had a quiet life as Theodore Blackwood's obedient wife. Margaret laughed, the sound full and free. Theodore did me the greatest favor of my life when he rejected me. Imagine if I'd spent my days biting my tongue and pretending to be meek. The world would have lost a force of nature. Sam agreed. And I would have lost you. They stood together, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. In the distance, they could hear the party continuing. Laughter, music, the sound of community and belonging. What now? Sam asked. You've conquered Willow Creek, revolutionized ranching, and become a newspaper story. What's left for the stubbornest woman in Texas? Margaret smiled, already envisioning the future. Well, I've been thinking about starting a formal school for women, and there's that new telegraph system. Imagine if ranchers could share information about prices and breeding stock instantly. Oh, and I want to expand the garden, maybe try some experimental crops. Sam laughed, pulling her close. Of course you do. God help me, I wouldn't have you any other way. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Margaret caught sight of Henrietta strutting past, having apparently established her new territory to her satisfaction. The sight made her smile. Even the chickens were stubborn on the McKenna ranch. Inside, the warmth of friendship and acceptance wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket. Young women eager to learn, neighbors who'd become friends, a community that had learned to value strength in all its forms. Margaret Sullivan had stepped off a stagecoach 1 year ago, rejected as too stubborn for marriage. Margaret McKenna stood here now, claimed and celebrated for that very stubbornness, surrounded by love and purpose and the life she'd built by refusing to be anything other than herself. The journalist from Philadelphia would write his articles, and perhaps other women would read them and find the courage to seek their own paths. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, there was dancing and laughter and the sweet satisfaction of a battle hard won. As Sam spun her around the parlor to the fiddle's tune, Margaret thought she heard him murmur, "That's my woman, stubborn, difficult, and absolutely perfect." And for once in her life, Margaret Sullivan McKenna didn't argue at all. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you enjoyed following Margaret's journey from rejection to triumph. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Sam's story in the comments below. Did her stubbornness inspire you? Let's connect and discuss this tale of love, courage, and staying true to yourself against all odds.